Good evening, everyone, and my apologies for the late start tonight. We've been beset by a few technical difficulties because all sides are travelling. I'm David Epstein from the Chifley Research Centre, and welcome to our 8th Chifley conversation for the year. Tonight we're having a conversation with Van Badham about her most recent book, QAnon and On. But first of all, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. Both Van and I are joining you tonight from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and of course the Chifley Research Centre is located on Ngunnawal land. We'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the country from which we are joining you tonight and the custodians of the country from which you join us tonight. We'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Well, good evening everyone. As I said, we are joined by Van Badham. Van will be well known to many of you as an author, Guardian columnist, I suppose provocateur at times, and she's also a theatre creator, having written a number of plays, including 3 for some of Australia's most well-known theatre companies. She's joining us tonight to discuss her latest non-fiction book, which is QAnon and On. Which she had published by Hardy Grant late last year. And it's a fascinating read because it's something that Van got started on after being, I suppose, trolled by a few of these people online. And then she delved into the whole world of digitised conspiracy. And what she has to say is in parts shocking, surreal, but ultimately absolutely revealing. So I'd like to begin tonight by asking Van to tell us in her own words why she wrote this thing and what she's had to say and what she discovered, and then we'll throw to questions. Van, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, David, and it's great to be doing this event for Chifley. You've always been so good to me. So I obviously want to acknowledge that I am on Gadigal land tonight. I typically live on the land of the Wathaurong people in Victoria. And it's quite the change of scene coming from the People's Republic of Victoria to what I refer to with maximum politeness as neoliberal South Wales. So my adventure with QAnon started because I live on the internet. I am a person who tweets every hour if I'm not sleeping, in which case I feel it's interrupting my tweeting. I obviously publish to The Guardian Australia, which is a web-based publication in Australia, and I am part of the public political internet discourse. As you can imagine, identifying as a woman, that is like having a large target on my head saying, please take all your personal problems out on me. So I have become very used to the background noise of trolling, unfortunately. And lovely to see one of my, more prominent antagonists receive his community service sentence for 150 hours today, Mr. Nathan Sykes, who encouraged neo-Nazis on the Daily Stormer website to run me over in a car because no judge would convict them for killing me. So I have become used to this, as I've said, is like background noise. To every action on the internet, there's an opposite reaction if you're a woman, and it usually involves a death threat. But around 2017, 2018, and this is very early in the story of QAnon, I started receiving extremely weird trolling messages that came with a level of apocalyptic language that I hadn't seen before. And of course, this happens once or twice, and you just think, oh, it's some rando. But there was something quite consistent about these apocalyptic kind of, we're on to you, nothing can stop what is coming, enjoy the show, die, cultural Marxist elite, die. And my habit has become over the past few years is that I file everything I get from trolls, because unfortunately I have been subject to harassment in my home. I have been subject to physical violence. Unfortunately, what happens online spills offline incredibly quickly, and I just have to be vigilant. That's part of my job. And so I started filing these particular threats and tracing them back to their originating accounts and seeing the repetition of this language around this internet prophet called Q. And I was like, what is this? Like, what is this strange sort of cult that I've attracted somehow, and how have I attracted it? And of course, within a matter of months, American journalism started picking up on this as well, because this was clearly attacking other prominent identities who would be associated with the liberal media or with the political centre left. And read an article by Adrienne LaFrance called The Prophecies of Q, where she, investigative journalist who writes for The Atlantic, had put together a feature about this modern cult that was organised on the internet, that was a descendant of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Pizzagate, Pizzagate was a crazy rumour that spread through sort of obscure internet forums in 2016 that insisted that Hilary Clinton was a child eating and raping pedophile. Not just a child raping pedophile, but a child eating one. And that she and other elites from Hollywood and the media and the Democratic Party were abducting 800,000 children a year in the United States, hiding them in tunnels with the complicity of various government organisations, and then sacrificing them in cellars. And I'm not making this up, this is what they believed. Sacrificing them in cellars in satanic rituals where they would drink the blood of children for a chemical called adrenochrome, which is a real chemical but is not really very relevant to anything, which is produced when your adrenaline spikes. And adrenochrome was giving all of these celebrities and prominent identities like eternal life and youth and vitality. And this Pizzagate rumour spread on the internet, reached sort of critical mass when Alex Jones is a very well-known sort of internet conspiracy theorist in America, runs a site called InfoWars, when he picked up on this and insisted it was true. And a young man from North Carolina, from a town called Salisbury, who'd had various problems in his life, decided that he would avenge all these children, and he went to Washington, D.C., armed to the teeth, with automatic rifles and shotguns and knives and rounds of ammo, to this pizza restaurant that supposedly was holding these, satanic orgies with Hilary Clinton, and shot up the place. And of course, there was no basement. There was obviously no Hilary Clinton because there were no pedophiles. This was all an internet rumour. But QAnon metastasized this story, and this internet prophet called Q, who had appeared on 4chan and then moved to 8chan, which is a very similar sort of Wild West type anonymous discussion board, image board website, created these posts which insisted there was a war between the deep state and, the Democrats and Hollywood and all the elites against the patriots, the good, honest people who knew that President Trump was their champion and he was going to be saving these children, and all of his political activities could be justified in this context. Like he was playing four-dimensional chess. And it was an extraordinary story because it was just so easy to disprove. Like it was 800,000 children do not go missing in the United States every year. In reality, it's about 130 kids. Most of them they trace to like extreme family dysfunction. There are not child catchers roaming the streets at night to snatch children to torture them for their screams. That is literally the plot of Monsters, Inc. Like these are not real things. But there was a community of people who wanted to believe them to be true. And this absolute passion for believing untrue things had organised into a community of consumers who were not only following this discussion on 4chan, but on Reddit, and then in Facebook, and then in various Twitter communities. And it had become certainly a cult, and like a hybrid of a cult and a political movement, and certainly an expression of a radical right in the United States that the left didn't really have a handle on. And I was approached by more and more of my following, because I live on the internet. What happens on the internet, if it's dominating conversations, usually gets back to me. And I was contacted by a number of people through my Facebook page going, my uncle, my brother, my cousin, my mother has been drawn into this QAnon community. What do I do? And I wrote an article about it. I did some research about like QAnon in this context, and who these people were and what their triggers were and how you dealt with people essentially who had joined this internet cult. And that article went totally viral, and it turned out there was a massive worldwide audience of extremely concerned people who were dealing with loved ones who had essentially joined this cult. And it was in 2020, it was the height of the pandemic. People were trapped inside. This is, just as the vaccines were getting started, there was a lot of fear and so much disinformation. And this sort of online mobilization of the wildest propaganda you could ever imagine. And I was approached by Hardy Grant, who published QAnon and On, who'd seen the article and asked if I wanted to do a book about it. And my interest around doing a book became about disinformation and how internet conspiracy cults are just another front in the ongoing information war. And I have two friends who are very active in this space who are also writers who are based in the United States. One of them is Talia Lavin, who wrote an exceptional book called Culture Warlords, where she infiltrated all these online communities of modern neo-Nazis and fascists to see how they were organising on the internet. And the other one was a woman called Nina Yankovic, who's just been appointed in a senior position in the Biden administration, who's a disinformation scholar with the Wilson Center, who wrote a brilliant book called How to Lose the Information War, which was all about disinformation campaigns that had been run by the Russian government, the Putin-aligned Russian government, in Estonia and Ukraine. And sort of speaking to these women and reading their work and studying QAnon, it became very apparent, two things were apparent, that the disinformation networks were not haphazard. Like, these weren't just a bunch of 4chan people with a joke that got out of control. They weren't just a bunch of crazy crank conspiracy theorists who were comparing, designs for tinfoil hats online. That there was actually an involvement in this space of some extremely sophisticated bad faith political actors. And of course, I started writing the book properly in 2020, and I went undercover immediately into the QAnon community and posed as one of them and studied them from the inside, got to know them and got to understand them. And as I did, the personas I created on various internet fora started to be targeted by very niche political campaigns. I received a lot of very highly targeted Liberal Party material, and I received a lot of highly targeted UAP material. And it was particularly interesting because I had come through, of course, the 2019 election in Australia and had been shocked, like a lot of people were, by the Labor loss, but also remembered back to 2019 and the level of disinformation that I'd seen shared online about Bill Shorten, about Labor Party policy. Infamously, there was the death tax internet rumour, which had no grounds in reality, but was an extremely potent piece of internet propaganda that had been created, who knows who by. Except that I went back to that propaganda and realised that that particular death tax rumour actually resembled in all ways, including down to the figures that were used about what the death tax that didn't exist would cost, was a campaign that had been run by Steve Bannon in 2016 as part of the Trump campaign that was targeted to various communities in Florida. And it became very apparent that disinformation channels and pipelines have been extremely useful, not only to nefarious anti-democratic international actors like the Russians, and of course the Chinese, the Iranians, a number of different government-associated entities that are involved in this space, but also domestic political actors in Western democracies. And it was that sort of fascination about how propaganda on the internet has become so sophisticated and has become a front in the political war that really is what the book became about. So that's the framework that I began studying, and I've got to say, you can imagine my awareness of those particular movements has a striking new context, given the fact that I am still undercover in those communities, watching the intense radicalisation and the physical mobilisations of the anti-lockdown movement that started to manifest in Canada, in New Zealand, in the United States, in Europe, and in Australia, in Canberra, wouldn't you know it, in the 2 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. So you can imagine my research has sort of placed me to look at these events not as isolated phenomena of a bunch of nutters, which is very easy to make a reading of, but as part of an organised anti-democratic political movement in which very susceptible and vulnerable people have been swept up.
Right. there's a lot of threads there. We've got non-state disinformation. We've got potentially state disinformation. You've spoken about organisations, and what interested me was at the start, you spoke of a cult. And we seem to have these sort of communities of interest here. You're saying, I believe, that it's organised. It's not just simply organic with some organisation around the fringes. I'm just wondering whether we could sort of unpack that, particularly, what you describe as a cult. Do you mean a cult, a sort of monotheistic cult, in the sense that we're used to thinking about them, or is it more just a community of interest which others are exploiting and some are just sucked into?
One of the things I learned in my research is that it's all of these things at once. So QAnon began on 4chan. Some random anonymous account starts saying Hilary Clinton is going to be arrested for her terrible crimes in the next few days. And I'm a secret agent and I can't tell you my identity, but I will be leaking all this information here. And other anonymous accounts purporting to be the same person, but they may not have been the same person, started sort of echoing this. They're also going to arrest Democratic Party Chair John Podesta, and they're also going to arrest Oprah and various other people, and naming sort of various Clinton staffers and associated Democratic identities. Now, 4chan is a place where people also publish photos of what they put in the toilet. It's where Anonymous, who are the hacker collective, started. It's the place where Rick rolling, where you get a video and you think it's going to be about the UN and it turns out to be Rick Astley. Like internet pranks and memes, lolcats, things like that all started on 4chan because it's anonymous and there's almost zero moderation and you can put whatever you like. There was a habit on 4chan of what they call LARPing, which are these sort of live action role playing games where people pretend to be secret agents or displaced aristocrats or, criminals or neo-Nazis or whatever, and everybody plays along. And it's an internet game. Within a few days of this appearing on 4chan, a well-known conspiracy theorist from like the Washington area in America, a woman who called herself online Tracy Beans, who ran a YouTube channel that talked about conspiracy theories that had a few thousand people. She picked up these Q posts and started making videos going, a secret agent is revealing this stuff about Hilary Clinton. It's all happening on 4chan. I'm going to try and decode and explain all the coded language that's going on in these posts. And within 4 days of her starting to post about this, Tracy Beans's YouTube videos were shared on Twitter by a networked group of 4,000 Russian government aligned accounts. And it's one of the things I learned from Nina Yankovic's research is that what specifically Russia's activity in this space has been, and this is something that has been sort of standard disinformation war policy since the Soviet era, is that if you are trying to discredit and destabilize even the concept of democracy itself, you don't manufacture a crisis. You look for fault lines that already exist within a society and you exaggerate and amplify those fault lines. And that's what causes discord and disharmony. Certainly you can look at QAnon because we know that Russian government actors were involved in promoting it online in the example I've just given you. It's playing on that, extreme hard right community in America, that mistrust of political leaders, this sort of, and at the time it appeared at the end of 2017, the Trump administration was in trouble. Donald Trump didn't really seem to be the genius that he had insisted he was. They were having, various economic problems and it wasn't amazing. Like he hadn't brought world peace or, ended the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he certainly hadn't, denuclearized North Korea. So there was a community of people who were on the right who were really looking for a justification for the sort of messianic obedience they had towards Trump. And QAnon really supplied that. And what Russian state government actors did was just push that community and those messages far enough that it went from an organic creation of 4chan, picked up by Tracy Beans and a couple of other people who she worked with, and found its community through amplification. And then you had these thousands and thousands of people who started to join. Tracy Beans ran a Reddit community called Calm Before the Storm, which was a Trump quote. And people who didn't get 4chan and weren't on 4chan, but found her through YouTube or found her through Reddit. And these different platforms that have different audiences reached out to different people who were all sort of looking for the same thing. And it's absolutely a cult because it's a desperate desire of willful and willing to believers to seize on messages that are not true, that don't have evidence, but the mere utterance of gives them the opportunity, gives them an opportunity for meeting an emotional need. So you are concerned that America is not great again yet. You're concerned that the presidential candidate that you may have lost family members for supporting hasn't delivered anything proportional to your sacrifice. You have this emotional need to believe that the Trump presidency is some kind of, ethical and moral miracle as opposed to, the kind of sump pit it was. And so these messages, you're extremely receptible to them and find a community of other people who are just like you, who are willing to back those messages in. And that's how it functions as a cult, because it also, it's about shared messages and it's about this illusion of community, people who agree with you and will back in your claims. And it's special and exciting, this idea that this secret agent is releasing these coded messages that only you and your political community can understand, that you're positioned as part of a secret war, you're special, you're a patriot, you're a digital soldier. These are all terms that are used to appeal to these people by Q, this anonymous internet prophet, and the sort of infrastructure around them. It's very seductive, and it's seductive in the same way any cult is seductive, simple answers to complex problems, very like a polarized and binary analysis of the universe. And when I was researching the book, I interviewed a clinical psychologist from Melbourne about conspiracy belief and obviously studied other papers that had been written about this. But he described it as there's a psychological phenomenon that occurs when people are overwhelmed by information and are in distress because they're overwhelmed by information or too many provocations. And the phenomenon is called the paranoid schizoid position, and psychologists call it splitting. And it's when information has become so difficult to make nuanced judgments about because the person is in distress, of course there's just too much of it for them, that they look for a means to polarize information. With us or against us, black, white. In the QAnon lingo, it's darkness and the light, or patriots and the cabal, the evil cabal of pedophiles. And it's a sorting hat that only offers two criteria, good and evil, and that's very attractive to people who are in distress. Suddenly, there's a framework that gives them these simple answers and promises an end to their distress through this simplification. Of course, like any cult, this doesn't have longevity, because cults only exist as long as they can sort of draw out the solution. It's that yearning for the answer that keeps people in the cult. And over time, because the answer doesn't appear, because it can't, because that's not the function of a cult, what happens is people do fall away as their emotional needs change. But that whole community, it is disturbing, because this is the thing, like the people who are attacking me online and saying that, I was part of a cultural Marxist conspiracy, if that conspiracy wants to get me involved, they can give me a call anytime. That'd be great. But I was part of a cultural Marxist conspiracy, and I was like defending pedophilia and all of these mad associations. These are the cousins and brothers and aunts and mothers of the people who are writing to me on my Facebook page going, what can I do? Who were being provided with these really simple targets in various contexts to attack and to prove their valor and their virtue by literally threatening the lives of people on the internet. And of course, I got a little bit of this stuff. There are people like Hilary Clinton who are subjected to this just constantly. And there's a quote in my book about an episode involving Malcolm and Lucy Turnbull, who were walking down the street and somebody pulled up in a car and screamed out, "Oh, you'll be condemned pedophiles." Like, there's a level of channeled fury towards people that is incredibly dangerous.
Mm. I just sort of want to tease that out because, I mean, what you appear to be saying is, there's a psychological need being fulfilled here, and that a lot of people have this. They're possibly overwhelmed by the ubiquity of information that we have available to us these days, and yet they have access to the ubiquity of communication that comes with it. But there's another side to this, in that if you want to check facts, you can check them a lot faster. We're all a lot more informed. And I think of some of the things you've described, I can see their antecedents in medieval times. I mean, things like, blood libel stories, etc., etc. My name's Epstein, so there's lots of assumptions made about, having a Jewish heritage. I've been associated with the Labor Party. I've been associated with politics. So you've got a combination of things that are triggers for, particularly hard right activists there. A Jewish heritage, progressive politics, association with people in power. But in my lifetime, before the internet really took off, before the early 90s, I'd get the occasional anti-Semitic thing, but there were no blood libels with it. There were no stories about people eating children, which are also often associated with blood libels. There were bizarre stories about Jewish people, financiers, powerful people, the Rockefellers, Bob Hawke, etc., pushed by LaRouchites. And then separately, the National Party, in its former guise as the Country Party, particularly out of Queensland, used to be very good at spreading conspiracies, but they were not driven by those sorts of things. They were things a bit like the death tax, etc., and they were seeded through pub talk and community organisations. But you seem now to have a coalescence of these things, but more to the point, in an era where people have access to facts, and facts can be corrected very rapidly, the blood libel originating stories seem even more bizarre than they were in medieval times. They're more complex, more horrific, etc., etc. What is this? Is it a psychological tendency, or is it a mass psychological illness, a psychosis?
Well, it starts with the psychological. It starts with the psychological vulnerability, but it becomes a sociological problem, is the conclusion that I came to writing the book. And over the course of my research, and Talia Lavin has done a lot of the research around this, because specifically her interest is in neo-Nazis and anti-Semitism. And her book really is wonderful. I can't recommend it enough. But she traces like the origin, and it was the anthropologist Norman Cohn who did the analysis that found the origin of the myth of the evil deep state actors in their basement eating children. It actually predates the blood libel. It's 2,500 years old, and and can be traced because they kept records back to the Romans. One of the things that the QAnon mythos is particularly good at doing is recycling and absorbing old conspiracy theories in order to give their accusations a sense of cultural heft and history. And, this is an unbelievably cynical, explicitly hard right movement. They've got absolutely no moral compunction about stealing the blood libel and conspiracy theories associated with anti-Semitism and weaving them into this sort of broader, grand mythos. So typical targets of QAnon are people like George Soros, who is, of course, quite Jewish and a Holocaust survivor. Anthony Weiner, who was Jewish, who was sort of the disgraced husband with the lurid text messages to a 15-year-old girl, who was the husband of Hilary Clinton's deputy chief of staff. There are all of obviously Jeffrey Epstein is central to QAnon mythos. the Rothschilds. Like the Rothschilds are repeated again and again and again, and these insistences that, and they're very careful about using explicit anti-Semitic terminology, but all our old favourites from hundreds of years of anti-Semitism are all there and weaved into this. Q did individually respond to like images shared with their account directly that were explicitly anti-Semitic. Like it's there. And of course, it's interesting, like the cultural Marxists who are, literally the Reds under the beds in QAnon mythos. The cultural Marxist means Jewish because it's associated with the Frankfurt School, who are, of course, the overwhelmingly Jewish socialists based at the University of Frankfurt in the lead up to the Second World War. Often I've been like, why do they hate me so much? And a friend of mine did say, oh, just they all think you're Jewish. Nathan Sykes, who got his community service order today, was convinced that I was Jewish, and apparently this was part of the attack. Was quite honoured, actually. A good way to express my solidarity with a particular cause. But this is woven in, and it's not. It's interesting because in my research, I discovered there is actually a community of QAnon believers in Israel. One of the most famous QAnon moments was a woman called Melissa Rain Lively, who is from the Jewish community in Tucson, Arizona, like wealthy middle-class woman who famously had a total breakdown in a Target during the pandemic and filmed herself trashing a mask stand, screaming at a mask stand. And this video went viral of this woman losing it. And she was promptly arrested and filmed her arrest as well, and accused everybody of being the new Reich. And she spent 8 weeks in intensive psychotherapy and has come out the other side. And she has been traveling the world explaining that that QAnon and the kind of propaganda around that particular movement can get you when you're vulnerable. And she was explaining she was from a family of Holocaust survivors. She was trapped at home during the pandemic. She was totally freaking out about what the pandemic would mean, potential threats to like her family's business and the rest of it. And she struck a piece of propaganda, which was entirely fake, of Jews being loaded into a train and being made to wear masks. Now we know that that was not, nobody was given the benefit of masks in that particular scenario, as well we know, but it got her at a psychologically vulnerable time. And she started to imbibe all of this propaganda through this lens of it's happening again, the Holocaust is happening again, and was incredibly vulnerable to it. She gave this rather extraordinary interview with Haaretz, where she said it was sort of amazing that her brain just filtered out the anti-Semitic content because she so wanted to gravitate towards this belief system and have simple answers and have someone to be angry at and to take all of her tension out upon, that it was almost like a willful blindness to the content that she was consuming, that in any other context she would have been like, well, this is obviously anti-Semitic. But, I want everyone to be aware that QAnon is quite, like an equal opportunity oppressor. Like QAnon hates feminists. QAnon really has a problem with transgender people. Obviously, the LGBTQIA mafia are coming for us all in the night. Black Lives Matter is a problem, as you can imagine, for the rest of them. And we're all going to meetings and organising as the cultural Marxist left who have manipulated the deep state. And we're, obviously we'll have to work together to snatch these millions of children all over the world in the middle of the night. And I mean, it is totally bonkers. But it is that whole thing that Melissa Rain Lively talks about this willful belief that like a conspiracy octopus is willing to adjust to whatever your particular vulnerability is. And it's interesting that in different countries, QAnon manifests in different communities. It gets in different ways and preys on different kinds of paranoias. And obviously in the United States, overwhelmingly, QAnon people are associated with the evangelical right of the Republican Party. And phrases like the Great Awakening, which is this moment when the whole world will realise QAnon people are right. I mean, that's just taken straight from 200 years of evangelical Protestantism in the United States. It's a familiar trope. and a lot of the language they use. But like I said, QAnon's in Israel, QAnon's in Germany, and in Australia, as in Germany, it got in through the wellness community and, communities of people who are like suspicious about modern medicine and, practicing these sort of alternative health information, health options. During the pandemic, of course, became very susceptible, given the talk of the vaccine and, the nature of the virus and the fact that we didn't really know what was going on. QAnon was like, well, this is all a deep state conspiracy. They're trying to put microchips in your blood. And the phenomenon described is called fusion paranoia, where, conspiracy theorists on one hand and sort of wellness advocates, anti-vaxxers on the other, discover they have this paranoia in common that is, bodily health and integrity, and start sharing and cross-pollinating one's belief system. In Japan, there's a QAnon community that's quite fixated on the royal family and blames the royal family, and their nefarious activities, the imperial family in Japan, for the triple disaster of the tsunami in whenever it was, 2007. I'm sorry, I can't remember that detail.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's part of, so it will adjust and adapt and bring in local identities and create local scenarios. Like Daniel Andrews and Michael Gunner are absolute icons of Australian QAnon dictator Dan. And I mean, Michael Gunner, who's the Chief Minister of the NT, was getting death threats from these people against his 2-year-old child for imposing lockdowns in the Northern Territory. And like I said, it's quite rubbery and they can readjust the mythos. And because there are all of these communities that, are constantly affirming and reaffirming one another, they share these mythologies and refine them like a process of willful groupthink until they get a belief system that they're all sort of eager to adopt. And this is the thing, the internet is infinite facts. Whatever you want to know, if human beings know it, you can find it. But what's really terrifying about QAnon is, there's this belief on the left that, and it is as willful a belief as any other. And there've been, op-ed columns about this saying, oh, well, this is a low SES problem. And, these are the poor victims of globalization and blue collar people who are denied education opportunities, who are just victims or passive victims of this internet propaganda. And it's the most patronising, paternalistic, classist guff I've ever heard. Because the reality is that QAnon adherents are overwhelmingly bourgeois. Like they are, Tom Nichols, who's an American writer, refers to these people as the lumpen bourgeoisie. They have the time to invest in this stuff. They have the money to invest in this stuff. And they're from a narcissistic social milieu that, for whom, I call them like post-material materialists, where they enjoy such a privileged position in society that they are absolutely concerned with maintaining their unearned status advantage and also want this, this valor and this virtue from being in this movement where they are not only like wealthy, but they are patriots and they are digital warriors and they are, the saviors of America or whichever country they're in.
So we shouldn't be surprised about speculation of this sort of stuff taking hold among the wellness movement of Sydney's northern beaches, for example.
Of course not. I mean, that's exactly the demographics that we're talking about, and there's heaps of it. I mean, who has the time? Which working class person has the time to just go to Canberra and camp out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks? And I mean, the data. I mean, there's always been a lot of data about, particularly the communities that got radicalized by ISIS. Overwhelmingly, the ISIS adherents were from middle class communities. We have a distortion in the West where a lot of data that was based around sort of European extremist movements in the sort of lull period before the whole QAnon thing kicked off again. Like we're used to an analysis that's based in the former Eastern Bloc countries and displaced, impoverished young people who were drawn into extremist movements for a sense of identity. And certainly that was true in the republics of the former Yugoslavia, and that was true in Poland. But that's not who we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with a community of displaced working people looking for status by gravitating towards racist politics. One of the things that's really interesting about the kind of QAnon movement and the associated movements, your anti-lockdown people, what we've seen, what Australians have nicknamed the cookers, which by the way is short for cooked units. What we know about them is that they are not, they're not explicitly racist, and this is why they're sort of hard to pin down, because they're not like the radical right that we grew up with. They're what American sociologists call the culturalist right, where rather than defending the superiority of a race in the way traditional Nazi does, the culturalist right are defending like a vision of culture, a culture that they wish to control, and they're not policing race as a point of entry to that. And it's like, how are there Jewish QAnon people? How are there Black QAnon people? How are there Hispanic QAnon people? In Australia, around these movements, there's quite a large South Asian community of QAnon here, QAnon-ish, QAnon adjacent participants. There's a significant community of Pacifica people. Like if you went to the anti-lockdown protests in Sydney or Melbourne or Canberra, it's quite alarming. The level of diversity that's there is not what you'd expect it to be, thinking in terms of an old sort of neo-Nazi mobilization. The neo-Nazis are certainly QAnon adjacent. They're certainly going to all of their events and activities. But it's this vision of culture, like this vision of Donald Trump's America, this make America great again, like the upside down red ensign flag, a notion of Australia and Australiana. It's different because its targets are not a racial minority. Its targets are not a racial other. Its targets are the very institutions that build culture that challenge them. It's not a coincidence they set fire to Old Parliament House. That is a perfect symbol for them as like a repository of Australian democracy and government. Of course, they were going to attack it. Like they attack Parliament buildings. Like they set fire to the lawns of the Parliament House in Wellington in New Zealand. They shut down the streets of Ottawa around the capital infrastructure of Canada. Like they the fact that they attack Hollywood celebrities and people like the Pope. The Pope is definitely unpopular with QAnon, I believe is the right term. The reason why they do this is because their attack is on any institution that can move the culture in a place that doesn't represent their vision of what the culture should be like. And that's really disturbing because that is like bigger, more that's like bigger than anything any neo-Nazi has been able to manage over the decades since the Second World War.
Okay, so through the efforts of people like you, we now know a lot more about them. There's a lot more public conversation about it, which should put people on alert. The political parties in Australia, 2019, perhaps should have learnt their lesson. In Britain, there were similar stories, particularly around Brexit, but also continuing through local government elections and indeed the last British national election. We're on the cusp of an election now. There's a lot of things we should be thinking about. We're talking about this stuff. Some of the proprietary operators of Web 2.0, like Meta, etc., perhaps reacting to political pressure, seem to be doing some things to either slow this stuff down or at least identify it. Should we be as concerned as perhaps we should have been in 2019 on the cusp of a 2022 Australian election about this stuff?
Oh,
And
literally.
what do we have to look for and how are we going to stop it?
All right, I love Facebook and the triumph of propaganda over reality. Facebook have said that they've axed all these accounts and they've shut down all these sites. In my fake QAnon personas, I was able to make 4,000 like-minded friends in 24 hours on Facebook and get around the filters and get around everything else. So the capacity of those platforms to host this stuff is still there. Facebook could get rid of it tomorrow. Like in Germany, where it is a federal offence to share Nazi, explicit Nazi or anti-Semitic propaganda, Facebook complies with local law and just shuts things down completely because they have to. It's condition of operation. Absolutely, there's a reform of the platforms that is necessary. In the wake of the Christchurch shooting, which was, I should say, broadcast live on 8chan, the Australian government intervened in the wake of that and shut down 8chan. Shut it down. It was inaccessible in Australia. Governments can do that all the time. And we have to look at a regulatory environment for the platforms that identifies the threat of extremism, because the FBI has identified QAnon as a domestic extremist threat. And like Andrew Lee, who's the member for FENA in Canberra, now has an intervention order out against one of these people because of threats made to his office. We know that there have been even a coalition MP in Victoria who was identified by these people as, spuriously involved in deep state cabal business, was also in the same situation. And I repeat, the attacks are on symbols of democracy. The issue we have in Australia is we're particularly vulnerable for two reasons. One, because it's been in the interest of various domestic political actors to have these propaganda communities that they can disseminate lies to, and lies that will be accepted and shared uncritically. And certainly, if you know where to look, you can pump propaganda with the triggers that will ensure that it gets shared. Because this is the thing, like QAnon people don't only hang out with QAnon people. QAnon people, or, anti-lockdown people, anti-vax people, they have on average 150 friends who trust them to various degrees. But you also have like nonsense that goes on in the community with people who say things like, well, there's always a grain of truth to conspiracy theories, aren't there? There's always a grain of truth. I did an interview with quite a prominent Australian media identity who, when I was talking about the book, was like, actually said, yeah, but it repeated this line and went, yeah, but, we know that there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. And I was just like, yeah, no, I went to the book depository. I've been there. I went to Texas, I went to Dallas, and I went to the Grassy Knoll and the book depository. And can I just say for the record, I would have been able to shoot JFK from the book depository. It was the cleanest shot imaginable, and it's not as far away as you might think. But that kind of, that's the conspiracy equivalent of both sidesism. Oh, both sides do it. There's always a grain of truth. And that means that those propaganda communities who are processing propaganda 24 hours a day, like the channels that I'm on, never stop. They never, ever stop. Every single world event piece of information is repackaged, recontextualized, and shared. So these people live in themselves in a sealed information environment where the ABC and Channel 7 and SBS, everything is run by communists, and you can't trust the mainstream media, and you should only get your information from some website that you don't know who owns it or is shared by YouTubers or whatever. But that information leaks out, and their message propagandists, the people behind or amplifying or vested in these communities, they're message testing all the time. You can see the Russians doing it. One of the things that was so fascinating to me in my fake personas, after months of it all being about, Joe Biden eats babies, or Joe Biden, sometimes they think Joe Biden's a clone, Donald Trump's coming back. It was all about the stolen election. And then it switched and it became vaccination. And vaccination was a plot, and Bill Gates was behind it. We're all going to turn into insects or develop magnetism, and spoons would stick to our necks. And they believed this. All of a sudden, it was the brave Russians liberating Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are all Nazis. And it's just switched that quickly. And the communities I'm in, these QAnon communities, are just absolutely awash with anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia propaganda. And I mean, it's obvious, of course they are. And that's been backed up. And that information ecosystem, when messages find a purchase, when a community is willing to go, well, yeah, maybe Ukraine is run by Nazis. They're not quite like us, and they don't quite speak the language. And Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union, is probably Russia anyway. They refine the points that will get an audience, and then you amazingly hear them on the Steve Bannon War Room podcast, or you hear them repeated by Tucker Carlson on his, endless, relentless show on Fox, or you hear it on, from Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert. They had a situation today that there was a congressional vote taken in the lower house in the United States about support for the NATO alliance. 57 Republicans voted against it, voted against NATO, the Republicans. And it's because, as a lot of American political theorists are saying, those Republicans, Marjorie Taylor Greene clearly believes this stuff because she is absolutely off the chart far-right bonkers. But you have a lot of other Republicans, people like Elise Stefanik, who's a rep from New York, who used to be considered a moderate Republican. Her position in the Republican Party and her and her continued representation relies on the support of QAnon type adherents, far right adherents, who've just mass joined the Republican Party. Like 1 in 4 registered Republicans believe in QAnon, and they're exercising enormous amounts of political power and holding their representatives in thrall to these beliefs. If you saw any of the hearings of Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was Biden's nomination to fill the Supreme Court vacancy, and that woman is like, you know, she's Harvard Law, she's an advanced legal scholar, she's the only Supreme Court justice in 60 years to have a background as a criminal defense attorney. Like her judgments are impeccable. Like there is no criteria that woman doesn't satisfy. But she was subjected to a line of questioning from Republicans who were implying that she was soft on child molesters. And she explained, you know, she can only pass sentences in accordance with laws that are set by politicians, and that always the law guided her sentencing. But that wasn't her answer wasn't the point. The point was those Republicans who were dog whistling to QAnon with the implication that Ketanji Brown Jackson was part of the deep state, who was excusing the crimes of the child-eating pedophiles like Hilary Clinton. And that's like mainstream position. In Australia, where it's disturbing is that compulsory voting, literally the greatest thing that ever happened to Australian democracy and something we should defend literally with our lives, means that that kind of extremism doesn't survive electorally. Like, you know, we know that maxes out at about 10% of the Australian population. We know that because everybody votes, and that vote is shared between Palmer and One Nation and the occasional completely unhinged independent candidates that pop up in various places. The problem we have here is because there's no electoral mechanism for them to exert influence, they are doing things like trying to shut down Canberra, and they are doing things like threatening the life of Andrew Leigh, and they are doing things like setting Parliament House on fire. And the idea of this radical right movement that can't achieve its political aims electorally, well, they are intensely mobilised. And watching the chat, and it's not just me, I mean, there's a whole network of extremism monitors in Australia, and we all talk to one another and keep an eye on things. Increasingly, in the wake of the Canberra protests not leading to revolution, we're seeing more and more chat about how, you know, violent times demand violent means and the rest of it. And that capacity for acts of stochastic terrorism, I am concerned, is particularly high.
Right. And I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating field, and, you know, it just grows and grows and grows. You know, it's almost like a tumbleweed. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, and we've actually, without posing some of the questions that have been posed in our Q&A, you've managed to touch on them too. But perhaps in going for the detail, we've missed some of the obvious things. And one of the questions that we've actually been asked tonight is, what is QAnon itself? How did the word come about? Is it a person?
Oh, I thought I had explained that. So QAnon is this guy. Q is the guy who pretended or claimed he was a secret agent and was posting on 4chan, right? That's Q. And then he made thousands of posts. QAnon is the community around that. The people who followed those posts on 4chan, and then went to 8chan, which is the other website where these posts appeared, and then to Reddit. And they don't call themselves QAnon. They call themselves patriots, and they see themselves as part of this movement, and Q is, you know, leading them to the truth. It's us who call them QAnon.
So do we know who Q likely is, or is it an amalgam? Or?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, you know, Q could be several people. We don't know, because the anonymity of Q has been protected by the platforms they're on. There's scholarship around who Q might be. It's highly likely that Q is a guy called, or the latest iteration of Q, because Q stopped posting after Biden won the election. The movement, of course, has continued because it generates its own propaganda. But Ron Watkins is the son of a dude called Jim Watkins, who's the owner of 8chan. And the Q community, the Q followers who were going there to hear the prophet speak, became very important to 8chan in terms of there being an audience that could be marketed to, essentially. So there are arguments that it could be Ron, or it could be Jim, it could be Jim and Ron. In the book, I talk about, various theories have been that it's Steve Bannon or Bannon adjacent operatives, or Michael Flynn, the disgraced former national security director who's giving secrets to the Russians, a close friend of Donald Trump's. Could be Donald Trump himself, some people believe. But it doesn't, what I came to the conclusion of was that it didn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter who Q is. The point is that this channel of discourse has been opened up that is funneling people who are vulnerable to lies and propaganda into a political mobilization that has had direct influence on the Republican Party in America, and which is out on the streets in Australia, threatening the children of chief ministers and causing chaos. And that's, when we talk about QAnon, that's who we're talking about. I'm sorry, I thought that was quite clear. You can imagine I've been immersed in this stuff for some time.
No, you certainly did touch on some of those things. I suppose it was just drawing out the thread of
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter who it is, because and in all likelihood, the first poster was probably some, like, one of the random 40-year-old IT workers who hung out on 4chan to be edgy and was having a joke with their friends. And their prank got picked up, adopted, taken off, refined, and reprocessed.
Yep.
And to suit, some really quite nefarious political ends.
Dan, fascinating. We've come to the top of the hour. So look, thank you very much for appearing tonight. For those who haven't read it, QAnon and On by Badham, published by Hardy Grant. As I always say, available in all good bookstores, but also online too, I believe. Well worth having a look at, because
there's an audio book now too.
And there's an audio book.
If you can't get enough of my fabulous Bogan accent, you can have 12 hours of it talking through everything that is wrong with the internet. And I'd also like to apologise for the fact that you have seen me tonight with my shoulders around my ears. I just don't have one of those setups for easy zooming. But I do have the lovely modernist house in the background.
That's all right. There'll be people out there looking for the modernist house now. Thank you very much. Next week, for our 9th conversation, we're going to be joined by Tim Dixon from the UK, who was one of the co-founders of More in Common, and one of his partners from Germany, Laura Kraus, who is now heading More in Common in Germany, but has recently been working on the last German election campaign. They've just completed some public opinion polling and focus groups researching the attitudes of people in 6 European democracies just ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then they've also been looking at the results in the context of what appears to be emerging trends in public sentiment since the invasion. Absolutely fascinating things that they've got to report. A lot of them touch on some of the insecurities that I suspect have driven QAnon and what we've been talking about tonight. So that will be next Wednesday, again at the same time, 6 p.m. Eastern State Time. Tim Dixon and Laura Kraus, and we'll send some information out through our subscriber base and social media over the course of the next few days. So good night and thank you all.
Is that it?
That's it. Good night.
Was that all right?
We're still live at the moment.
Hey everyone.
But people can offer their views. Okay, then I'll give you a call.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.